55 BC, the beaches of southern Britain. Waves crashed against the wooden hulls of Roman galleys as Caesar's legionaries waded through chest-deep water, weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment, shields held high against a storm of stones and javelins raining down from the shore. Above the roar of surf and screaming Britons, a sound emerged that would haunt Roman accounts for generations. The thunder of hooves and the rattle of wicker wheels. Celtic war chariots, weapons that Rome had never encountered in open battle, were bearing down on men who couldn't run, couldn't maneuver, couldn't even stand properly in the sucking sand and swirling current. Julius Caesar, standing on the deck of his command ship, watched as his veteran soldiers, men who had conquered Gaul, who had broken Germanic tribes, who had never retreated from any enemy, hesitated. For the first time in their professional careers, these disciplined killers saw something that made them question whether dying for Rome was worth it. Two-horse chariots driven by screaming warriors in checkered cloth, painted shields flashing, long swords held high, were splashing into the shallows at full gallop. Behind each driver stood a warrior, balanced impossibly on the bouncing platform, hurling javelins with deadly accuracy before leaping off to fight on foot, while the chariot wheeled away and returned for another fighter. The standard bearer of the 10th Legion, an anonymous hero whose name Caesar never recorded, made a decision that would change the course of British history. Clutching the silver eagle standard, the sacred symbol that could never be abandoned without eternal disgrace, he bellowed above the chaos, "Follow me, soldiers, unless you want to betray your eagle to the enemy. I shall do my duty to my country and my commander." And he jumped into the water, holding the eagle high, wading toward the enemy-held beach alone. That moment, that single act of either courage or calculated manipulation, broke the paralysis, because Roman legionaries would die before they let their eagle fall into barbarian hands. The invasion of Britain, one of Rome's most desperate military gambles, had begun with a crisis that Caesar's commentaries downplayed but could never quite hide. His soldiers, the best infantry force the ancient world had ever produced, had been terrified by cavalry tactics they didn't understand. But here's what the Britons didn't know as they drove their chariots through the Roman landing zones in a display meant to shatter enemy morale. They were facing a military system that didn't break. It adapted. Within weeks, Roman tactical doctrine would evolve to counter chariot warfare. Within months, British chariot tactics would become obsolete against Roman discipline. Within a year, the weapon that had dominated British warfare for centuries would prove useless against legionaries who had learned its patterns. This is the story of how Rome's most disciplined soldiers faced their worst nightmare, a mobile enemy with superior mobility fighting on home terrain with weapons Rome had never countered. And how Roman military doctrine, through observation, adaptation, and ruthless application of systematic violence, turned terror into tactical advantage. The Celtic war chariot was not some primitive wagon with an angry man standing in it. Modern reconstructions and archaeological evidence have revealed a sophisticated weapon system that had evolved over 1,000 years. The British chariots Caesar encountered were the culmination of centuries of tribal warfare, perfectly adapted to Britain's terrain, social structure, and fighting methods. They were light, fast, and utterly lethal in the hands of trained crews. The chassis was built from ashwood, chosen for its combination of strength and flexibility. The frame could absorb shocks that would shatter rigid construction. The wheels were remarkable pieces of engineering, one-piece bent circles of ash with iron tyres shrunk onto the rim. The diameter averaged about 90 centimetres, large enough to handle rough ground but small enough to remain manoeuvrable. The axle was mounted toward the rear of the platform, creating a natural forward weight bias that kept the horse's pulling effort efficient. The platform itself was just large enough for 2 men, roughly 1 metre wide and 1.2 metres long. The floor was made of leather straps woven across the frame, creating a suspension system that absorbed impact and allowed warriors to maintain balance over terrain that would throw riders from horseback. British warriors trained from childhood to fight from this bouncing platform, developing balance and timing that seemed supernatural to Roman observers. The pole extended forward about 3 metres, connecting to a yoke that sat across the necks of 2 horses. British horses were smaller than modern breeds, standing perhaps 13 hands high, but they were tough, fast, and trained specifically for chariot work. Each chariot required years of training for both horses and crew. The driver needed to control two animals moving at speed over broken ground while the warrior behind him threw javelins, all without the benefit of reins in the modern sense. Control was through voice commands, weight shifts, and a light hand on leather lines. But the real innovation was tactical. The chariot wasn't a battlefield weapons platform in the way Romans understood cavalry. It was a mobility system that delivered elite warriors to critical points, then extracted them for redeployment. The basic tactical cycle would have horrified any Roman cavalry commander used to charges and sustained melees. The chariot would accelerate to full speed, roughly 35 to 40 kilometers per hour over good ground. As it closed with the enemy line, the warrior would hurl 2 or 3 javelins. Before impact, the warrior would leap from the moving platform, landing at a run with his sword drawn and shield ready. He would engage, for perhaps 30 seconds to a minute, just long enough to kill or wound enemies and create chaos. Then the chariot, which had wheeled away during the engagement, would return at speed. The warrior would grab a handhold, pull himself back onto the moving platform, and the chariot would accelerate away before enemy infantry could respond. This cycle could be repeated indefinitely, with fresh warriors continuously hitting different points in the enemy line while exhausted fighters were extracted. It created a battlefield mobility that no infantry force could match. The psychological effect was devastating. Imagine being a foot soldier watching a warrior materialize from a speeding chariot, kill your comrade, and vanish before you could even react, only to reappear 50 meters away seconds later. The Britons had another advantage that Caesar's writings reveal. Their chariot warriors were aristocrats. In Celtic society, chariot fighting was the preserve of the warrior elite, men who had trained their entire lives for this specific combat style. They weren't conscripts or militia. They were professionals whose social status depended on their battlefield performance. The driver and warrior often came from the same noble family, brothers or cousins who had trained together since childhood. This created crew coordination that was nearly telepathic. The terrain of southern Britain was perfect for chariot warfare. The chalky downlands provided firm, smooth ground. The scattered woodlands and valleys created natural obstacles that channeled enemy movement. British warriors knew every hill, every stream, every patch of rough ground. They could lure enemies onto terrain that would break formations, then hit them with chariots on the flanks where the ground was firm. Against other British tribes, this system was dominant. Tribal warfare consisted of ritualized combats, where chariot nobles would challenge each other, fight brief melees, then withdraw. Battles were decided by the accumulation of individual combat victories and the breaking of enemy morale. The side whose warriors fought more bravely, or whose nobles killed more opponents, would win as the losing side's morale cracked and they retreated. Into this system came Rome, an enemy who didn't understand or care about Celtic combat rituals, an enemy whose soldiers weren't impressed by individual bravery, an enemy whose tactical doctrine was built around systematic violence, applied through unbreakable discipline. Caesar's invasion force in 55 BC consisted of 2 legions, roughly 10,000 heavy infantry, plus auxiliaries and cavalry. The 7th and 10th legions were veteran units that had spent the previous 3 years conquering Gaul. These were not fresh recruits. They were professional soldiers who had seen everything: mass Germanic warriors, Gallic cavalry charges, night attacks, sieges, river crossings, mountain warfare. They had never broken, never retreated without orders, never failed to execute their commander's orders, no matter how insane those orders seemed. Each legionary carried equipment that represented Rome's systematic approach to warfare. The gladius, a short stabbing sword roughly 60 centimeters long, was designed specifically for formation fighting where there wasn't room to swing. The scutum, a curved rectangular shield measuring 120 by 75 centimeters, was built from 3 layers of wood strips glued cross-grain and covered with leather and linen. It weighed about 10 kilograms and could stop anything short of a direct ballista hit. The pilum, Rome's throwing javelin, was an ingenious weapon with a soft iron shank that bent on impact, making it impossible for enemies to throw back and weighing down their shields. But the real weapon was training. Roman legionaries drilled constantly, practicing formations, weapon techniques, and battlefield movements until they became automatic. A legionary could form testudo, the famous tortoise formation, in seconds even under arrow fire. He could execute complex wheeling maneuvers that turned formations 90 degrees without breaking cohesion. He could march 30 kilometers in a day carrying his equipment, build a fortified camp in 3 hours, then stand watch and fight the next morning. Most critically, Roman training emphasized continuous combat. While Celtic warriors fought in brief, intense bursts before withdrawing, Romans were trained to maintain pressure indefinitely. A legionary would stab with his gladius, step back behind his shield to recover, and let the man behind him take his place in a continuous rotation that never gave enemies time to recover. This wasn't glorious. It was industrial-scale killing. The Roman tactical system was built on the cohort, a unit of 480 men divided into 6 centuries of 80. Each legion contained 10 cohorts. This gave Roman commanders unprecedented flexibility. Cohorts could operate independently, support each other, or mass for overwhelming local superiority. The checkerboard deployment, with cohorts staggered, so the second line could advance through gaps in the first, meant that Roman forces could maintain fresh troops in contact indefinitely. When these two military systems collided on the British beaches in 55 BC, Caesar's legionaries encountered something their training hadn't prepared them for. They had fought cavalry, they had fought in difficult terrain, they had fought against superior numbers. But they had never fought an enemy who could attack, disengage, and re-attack from a different direction faster than Roman formations could react. The landing itself was a disaster that Caesar's commentaries tried to minimize. The warships, called quinqueremes, couldn't beach close to shore because of the shallow grade. The legionaries had to jump into water that was chest-deep or deeper, wearing armor and carrying equipment. They couldn't form proper formations in the water, they couldn't use their shields effectively, they couldn't throw their pila with proper force, and they couldn't maneuver. The Britons, watching from the high ground, waited until the Romans were most vulnerable, strung out between ships and shore, unable to form up or retreat. Then they attacked with everything they had. War chariots splashed into the shallows at full gallop. The drivers somehow kept their footing on the slippery beach while warriors hurled javelins. Then they would wheel away before Roman javelins could reach them, circle, and attack from a different angle. Roman cavalry, attempting to land from separate transport ships, was scattered and unable to support the infantry. Individual legionaries stuck in the water could only raise their shields and pray while chariots charged past them, warriors stabbing downward with long spears or jumping off to engage in brief melees before remounting and escaping. This was the moment when the 10th Legion's Aquilifer, the eagle-bearer, made his legendary jump. Whether it was spontaneous courage or a calculated move to shame the hesitating legionaries didn't matter. The effect was immediate. Roman soldiers could not allow their eagle to be captured. The disgrace would be eternal. Entire units would be disbanded. The survivors would live the rest of their lives as objects of contempt. The landing became a grinding, brutal fight through the surf. Legionaries formed small shield walls as they reached shallow water, using the testudo formation to create moving fortresses that advanced step by step toward the beach. The Britons couldn't break these formations with chariot charges because the water slowed the chariots enough that Romans could set their shields and brace. Javelin volleys from the chariots clattered off Roman shields without breaking through. Once on the beach, the Romans did what they always did. They formed up. Sentries coalesced into cohorts. Cohorts formed lines. Officers restored command structure. Within 20 minutes of the first legionaries reaching dry ground, Caesar had a proper battle line. The Britons, who had been dominating the Romans in the water, now faced a different problem. A formed Roman line was nearly impossible to break with frontal attacks. The chariots tried. They charged the Roman formation at full speed, warriors hurling javelins and screaming war cries meant to shatter enemy morale. The Romans didn't break. They locked shields, took the javelin volleys on their shields, and waited. When chariots came too close, the front rank would hurl their pila. The heavy javelins, thrown from a set stance by men who had practiced the throw thousands of times, could punch through shields and wound horses. Several chariots crashed as horses went down, spilling drivers and warriors into the Roman line where they were quickly overwhelmed and killed. The Britons adapted, shifting to their preferred tactic of delivering warriors for brief melees, then extracting them. This worked better. Individual warriors would leap from chariots, engage the Roman line for seconds, then retreat before they could be surrounded. But they weren't breaking through. Roman lines were too deep, too disciplined. A warrior might kill one Roman, wound another, but then the gap would close and he would have to retreat or die. By nightfall of the first day, the Romans held a shallow beachhead. They had taken casualties, probably 50 to 100 dead and several times that wounded. But they had established a fortified camp, which the Britons had never seen before. The Romans had built a defensive ditch, rampart and palisade in less than 3 hours, creating a fortress where none had existed. The Britons, lacking siege equipment or tactics, couldn't assault it and withdrew. Caesar's commentaries describe the next several days as a stalemate. The Romans couldn't advance inland because British chariots would harass any column that left the fortified camp. The Britons couldn't dislodge the Romans from their beachhead. Both sides probed for weakness. The Britons tried night attacks, which the Romans repelled with sentries and quick reaction forces. The Romans tried sorties, which the chariots would surround and harry until they retreated. But something critical was happening during this stalemate. The Romans were learning. Every chariot attack was observed, analysed and discussed. Roman officers, trained to study enemy tactics, began to identify patterns. The chariots always approached from the same angles, using terrain to mask their approach. The warriors always dismounted at roughly the same distance. The extraction cycles followed predictable timing. The chariots couldn't operate in certain terrain types, couldn't charge uphill effectively, struggled in mud or sand. The Romans also noticed that British coordination broke down under sustained pressure. The chariot warriors were individuals seeking personal glory. They would compete with each other for the most daring attacks or the most notable kills. This meant that coordinated assaults would degrade into individual attacks as each warrior tried to outdo his peers. Romans, trained to fight as units rather than individuals, could exploit this. The critical engagement came about a week after the landing, when Caesar led a large foraging party inland. This was partially a necessity. The beachhead was running low on supplies, but it was also a test. Caesar wanted to see how the Britons would respond to a large formation operating in open country. The Britons responded with everything they had. Caesar estimated 4,000 warriors supported by perhaps 300 chariots. The Roman force consisted of 3 cohorts, about 1,500 men, operating in a large hollow square formation that protected the foragers in the centre. This was standard Roman procedure for operations in hostile territory. The chariot attack began as usual, with warriors circling the Roman formation and hurling javelins, but the Romans had learned. Instead of trying to maintain a static line, the cohort commanders ordered a slow advance. The Roman square kept moving, maintaining formation but continuously changing position. This disrupted British tactics because the chariots had to keep repositioning and the terrain kept changing. Then the Romans sprung their counter-move. One cohort suddenly halted while the other 2 continued forward, creating a gap in the square that looked like a weakness. British warriors, seeing an opportunity, concentrated their attacks on the stopped cohort. Chariots delivered wave after wave of warriors who engaged the Roman line in brief melees before withdrawing. The Romans were absorbing casualties but maintaining formation. Then, at an officer's command, the cohort suddenly contracted into a tight wedge formation and charged forward into the space where the chariots were manoeuvring. The charge wasn't fast by cavalry standards. Legionaries in armour couldn't sprint for more than a few seconds, but it was unexpected and disciplined. The wedge smashed into the area where the chariots were picking up withdrawing warriors. Chariots, caught in the middle of their extraction cycle with warriors on foot and drivers attempting to position for pickups, were suddenly fighting Romans at close range where their mobility advantage vanished. Drivers trying to turn their vehicles in tight spaces found Roman javelins hitting their horses. Warriors attempting to remount were pulled down by Roman infantry who had closed to gladius range. The neat cycle of attack, disengage, extract collapsed into chaos. The other 2 Roman cohorts, which had continued forward as if nothing was happening, suddenly wheeled and attacked the flanks of the British concentration. The Britons found themselves caught between 3 Roman formations that were advancing in perfect coordination. Chariot tactics required space to manoeuvre. The Romans had deliberately denied them that space. The British withdrawal was messy and cost them heavily. Caesar's account claimed 200 Britons killed for 12 Roman dead, numbers that are probably exaggerated but reflect a real Roman victory. More importantly, the Romans had demonstrated that chariot tactics could be countered through discipline and tactical flexibility. Over the next several engagements, Roman countermeasures became increasingly sophisticated. They learned that chariots couldn't charge into prepared infantry on broken ground, so they deliberately chose fighting positions with rough terrain protecting their flanks. They learned that chariot warriors dismounted at predictable distances, so they would have light infantry and cavalry ready to exploit those moments of vulnerability. They learned that British attacks lost cohesion over time, so they would deliberately protract engagements until British coordination broke down. The Romans also adapted their own tactics. They began deploying auxiliary cavalry to screen their infantry, forcing chariots to engage the cavalry first, and losing the element of surprise. They used velites, light infantry skirmishers, to harass chariots at range with javelins targeting horses and drivers rather than the armoured warriors. They built field fortifications rapidly, creating defensive strongpoints that chariots couldn't approach. Most devastatingly, the Romans learned to exploit the social dynamics of Celtic warfare. British warriors fought for individual glory and would take risks to achieve notable kills or daring feats. Roman officers would deliberately expose small units as bait, tempting British warriors into attacks that were unsupported. Then they would spring ambushes with superior numbers, killing the isolated attackers before support could arrive. The chariots, which had seemed invincible during the first days of the invasion, were becoming less effective with every engagement. Not because the Britons were fighting poorly, they were using the same tactics that had dominated British warfare for centuries, but because the Romans were adapting faster than the Britons could adjust. Caesar's 55 BC invasion was ultimately driven back to Gaul by storms that destroyed much of his fleet and the approaching winter. But it wasn't a military defeat. The Romans had established that they could land in Britain, fortify positions, and fight British armies on relatively equal terms despite the chariot advantage. When Caesar returned in 54 BC with a much larger force, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, the Britons found that Roman tactics had evolved even further. The 54 BC invasion saw the systematic destruction of British chariot warfare as a viable military system. Caesar's expanded cavalry force, which included Gallic auxiliaries experienced in fighting mobile opponents, could now screen the legions effectively. British chariots couldn't get close to Roman infantry without first defeating the cavalry screen, and in cavalry versus chariot combat, the mobility advantage was neutral, while Roman numbers and training provided the edge. The Romans also brought artillery, scorpions, and ballistae, bolt-throwing and stone-throwing devices that could engage chariots at ranges beyond javelin distance. A chariot crew circling a Roman position would suddenly face 3-foot bolts fired with enough force to punch through shields and riders. The chariot's advantage depended on being able to attack and withdraw safely. Roman artillery made that impossible. British resistance climaxed at the Thames River crossing, where Cassivellaunus, the British war leader, had positioned his best chariot forces to defend the ford. Caesar's description of this battle reveals how completely Roman tactics had evolved. The legions didn't attempt a frontal assault across the ford where chariots could massacre them in the water, the same situation that had nearly broken the invasion the previous year. Instead, Roman cavalry crossed upstream and downstream, establishing bridgeheads on both flanks. Then the cavalry attacked the chariot positions, from behind while the legions crossed at the ford. The chariots, caught between Roman forces on 3 sides and unable to maneuver in the confined space near the ford, were annihilated. Cassivellaunus lost perhaps 100 chariots and their crews, an irreplaceable loss of trained aristocratic warriors. After this defeat, British resistance collapsed. Cassivellaunus agreed to terms, and Caesar returned to Gaul having accomplished his objectives. The real conquest of Britain wouldn't come until 43 AD under Claudius, nearly a century after Caesar's invasions. But the lessons learned fighting chariots in 55 and 54 BC became part of Roman tactical doctrine. When the legions returned under Aulus Plautius, they faced British chariot forces that were still using the same tactics their grandfathers had used against Caesar. The Romans destroyed them systematically. The Battle of the Medway in 43 AD demonstrates how thoroughly Romans had solved the chariot problem. British forces under Caraticus and Togodumnus assembled massive chariot formations to contest the river crossing. The Romans responded with auxiliary Batavian cohorts, Germanic troops trained to swim rivers in full equipment. The Batavians crossed the Medway at unexpected points and attacked the chariot horses, the one truly vulnerable part of the chariot system. Without horses, chariots were immobile platforms. The drivers couldn't control panicked or wounded horses, and warriors couldn't fight effectively while their transport was out of control. The British chariot armies that had dominated the battlefield for a millennium were effectively extinct within a decade of the Claudian invasion. The Romans didn't just defeat chariot tactics, they made them obsolete. British warriors who survived the conquest had to adapt to Roman methods or become irrelevant. The story of Rome versus the Celtic Chariots reveals something profound about military evolution. The Britons had a weapon system that was genuinely superior in initial encounters. The chariots provided mobility, firepower, and shock effect that Roman infantry couldn't match. In the first days of combat, they dominated. But superiority in initial engagement means nothing against an enemy who learns. Rome's military system was built on systematic adaptation. Every battle was analysed, every tactic was studied. Successful innovations were disseminated throughout the army. Failed approaches were abandoned. This wasn't individual genius, though Caesar was certainly a skilled commander. This was institutional learning operating at a scale that tribal societies couldn't match. The Britons were brave, their warriors were skilled, their tactics were proven over centuries of intertribal warfare. But their military system was fundamentally conservative. Chariot warfare was tied to social status and tradition. Aristocratic warriors learned the techniques their fathers had used and their grandfathers before them. Innovation was limited because changing tactics might diminish the glory associated with traditional combat. Rome, by contrast, had no emotional attachment to any particular tactic. Roman military doctrine was purely functional. If something worked, keep doing it. If something didn't work, try something else. This ruthless pragmatism, combined with disciplined execution and systematic training, made the legions nearly unbeatable against opponents who relied on traditional methods. The refusal of Roman legionaries to break on those British beaches in 55 BC wasn't about personal courage, though that played a role. It was about systematic training that had made certain behaviours automatic. It was about unit cohesion built through shared hardship. It was about a military culture that prized discipline above individual glory. And it was about an institutional commitment to learning that meant every defeat became a lesson rather than a disaster. The Celtic Chariots were a beautiful, sophisticated weapon system that represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age military technology adapted into the Iron Age. They were fast, deadly, and in the hands of trained crews, nearly unstoppable against traditional opponents. But they were also inflexible, tied to specific terrain and tactics, dependent on individual skill rather than systematic training. When they encountered an enemy who could learn and adapt faster than they could adjust, they became obsolete. The thunder of chariot wheels that had dominated British battlefields for 1,000 years faded into silence within a generation of Roman conquest. Not because the Britons stopped being brave or stopped fighting, but because they faced an enemy who treated warfare as an engineering problem, rather than a test of individual valour. Rome didn't need to be better in the first battle. Rome just needed to make sure there was a second battle and a third, and that each time Roman tactics would be slightly better, slightly more refined, slightly more effective. The lesson of the Roman landings in Britain echoes through military history. Superior technology or tactics can win battles. But systematic learning, disciplined execution, and institutional flexibility win wars. The British warriors who drove their chariots into the surf to face Caesar's legions were everything their culture celebrated: brave, skilled, aristocratic, magnificent. They just happened to be facing an enemy who didn't care about magnificence, only about what worked. And in that collision between tradition and systematic pragmatism, pragmatism won. The legionaries refused to break not because they were braver, but because their entire system was designed to make breaking impossible. And that made all the difference. The transformation of Roman tactics against British chariots reveals something that military historians often overlook. The legionaries who landed in 55 BC were not automatically superior soldiers. They were men who had been systematically programmed through, training to respond to chaos with procedure. When British chariots thundered down the beaches, the initial Roman response was human terror. What separated these soldiers from other armies wasn't fearlessness. It was the psychological architecture that Roman training had built into their minds. Roman recruit training lasted 4 months of continuous drilling that broke down individual responses and rebuilt them as collective action. A new recruit would spend his first week simply learning to march in formation, not walking together, but moving as a single organism where each man's stride matched the unit's rhythm perfectly. The training was repetitive to the point of torture, forward march, halt, about face, form column, form line, 1,000 times until the movements became muscle memory that functioned even when the conscious mind was paralyzed by fear. Weapons training was equally systematic. Recruits practiced sword strokes against wooden posts 6 hours daily, repeating the same thrusts and cuts until their arms ached and their hands bled. The training swords were twice the weight of combat gladi, building muscle memory with implements that made the real weapons feel light. A trained legionary could execute the standard thrust, step, recover, sequence 30 times per minute indefinitely. This wasn't about teaching men to fight. It was about teaching them to kill efficiently while exhausted, terrified, and surrounded by chaos. The shield drills were perhaps most critical for countering chariots. Legionaries practiced forming testudo, the tortoise formation, under simulated missile fire. Training officers would have auxiliaries throw blunt javelins and shoot padded arrows at forming units. Any man who broke formation or flinched received punishment. The message was clear: your shield protects the man beside you as much as yourself. Breaking formation kills your brothers. This created a psychological bond stronger than individual survival instinct. When British chariots attacked the landing force in 55 BC, the initial terror was real, but underneath that terror was training asserting itself. Individual legionaries might not have understood what was happening, might not have known how to counter chariot tactics, but they knew how to form up. They knew how to lock shields. They knew how to present a unified front. These automatic responses, drilled until they were reflexive, kept the formation intact long enough for officers to impose tactical solutions. The British had no equivalent training system. Celtic warriors were brave, often fanatically so, but their combat training was individualistic. A young warrior would learn from his father or uncle, practicing with weapons and fighting in small-scale raids or intertribal skirmishes. The training emphasized personal prowess, the ability to defeat opponents in single combat. There was no systematic drill, no standardized techniques, no institutional knowledge passed through formal instruction. This meant that British tactical adaptation happened slowly, through individual innovation that might or might not spread through the warrior culture. If one chariot crew developed an effective technique against Romans, that knowledge might spread to their kinsmen or allies, but there was no mechanism to disseminate it to all British forces. Each tribe, each clan, each warrior band had to learn the same lessons independently. Rome had staff systems that modern armies would recognize. After every significant engagement, centurions would report to their tribunes, tribunes to the legate to the commanding general. These reports included detailed observations about enemy tactics, terrain conditions, weapon effectiveness, casualties, and lessons learned. Caesar himself compiled these reports into his commentaries, which became training materials for future commanders. The Battle of the Thames in 54 BC illustrates how this system functioned. After the previous year's invasion, Roman military intelligence had compiled a comprehensive analysis of British chariot tactics. This analysis identified specific weaknesses. Chariots required firm, relatively flat ground. They couldn't operate effectively in forests, marshes, or steep terrain. The horses, smaller than modern breeds, tired quickly under sustained exertion. The extraction cycle required precise timing and created moments of vulnerability. The crews consisted of only 2 men, and killing or wounding either would disable the entire chariot. Based on this analysis, Roman tactical doctrine evolved to include specific counter-chariot procedures. When facing chariots, infantry formations would advance toward broken ground, denying the enemy maneuvering space. Auxiliary cavalry would be positioned to exploit extraction cycles, charging in when warriors were dismounting or remounting. Light infantry would target horses and drivers rather than the armoured warriors. Artillery would be pre-positioned to create kill zones that chariots had to cross to reach Roman lines. At the Thames, these procedures were executed with devastating efficiency. Cassivellaunus had chosen the crossing point specifically because the approaches provided excellent ground for chariots. The Romans negated this advantage by refusing to fight where the Britons wanted. The cavalry crossings upstream and downstream weren't opportunistic improvisation. They were planned operations based on reconnaissance reports that had identified those crossing points days earlier. The synchronized assault from 3 directions wasn't luck, it was timing. Coordinated through signal systems that Roman forces had practiced for years. Standards raised and lowered in specific patterns communicated commands across distances where voices couldn't carry. Horn calls indicated different tactical movements. Officers positioned throughout the formation ensured orders were executed uniformly. The British forces fought bravely but chaotically. Cassivelaunus was a capable war leader by Celtic standards, meaning he was personally formidable and could inspire loyalty, but he commanded through personal presence and the respect his warriors gave him. He had no staff, no systematic communications, no way to coordinate actions across a dispersed battlefield except by riding to different locations himself and giving instructions personally. When the Roman cavalry established bridgeheads on his flanks, Cassivelaunus couldn't respond quickly. He had to gather his subordinate chiefs, explain the situation, convince them to abandon their current positions, and then trust they would execute his intentions without detailed instructions. By the time British forces redeployed, the Romans had already secured multiple crossing points, and the initiative had shifted irreversibly. The slaughter that followed was one-sided, not because British warriors were cowards, but because they were fighting as individuals against a coordinated system. Chariot crews trying to extract warriors from the fighting found themselves caught between Roman cavalry on one side and advancing legions on the other. The carefully choreographed dance of attack, disengage, extract broke down into chaos where chariots collided with each other, warriors were stranded on foot, and drivers were killed trying to rescue their companions. Roman casualties were minimal because legionaries maintained formation throughout the battle. Any British warrior who closed with Roman lines found himself facing not an individual opponent, but a wall of shields with multiple swords stabbing from the gaps. The few Britons who broke through the front rank encountered the second rank, then the third. Roman formations were typically 8 ranks deep, meaning a warrior had to kill or disable 8 men in succession to actually break through, and no one was that good. The psychological impact of this defeat on British forces was catastrophic. The Thames was supposed to be the great defensive barrier where Roman invasion would be stopped. The chariot forces assembled there represented the best warriors from multiple tribes. Their complete destruction in a single engagement shattered any illusion that traditional British tactics could defeat Rome. But the military impact was equally important. The loss of perhaps 100 chariot crews meant the loss of 200 highly trained warriors plus 200 trained horses. These weren't replaceable. Training a chariot crew required years. The horses had to be bred specifically for chariot work and trained from foals. The equipment had to be crafted by skilled artisans. The social structure that produced chariot warriors, aristocratic families with the wealth to maintain horses and equipment and the time to train, couldn't simply generate new crews on demand. After the Thames, British resistance increasingly relied on guerrilla warfare and fortified strongholds. Cassivelaunus adopted what modern military theory would call asymmetric tactics, avoiding open battle and instead harassing Roman foragers, ambushing small units, and retreating into fortified hill forts that required sieges to reduce. These tactics were more effective because they negated Roman advantages in open battle, but they also represented an admission that Britain couldn't defeat Rome in conventional warfare. The final submission of Cassivelaunus wasn't military defeat in the traditional sense. His forces remained intact and could have continued guerrilla operations indefinitely, but the political calculus had changed. Caesar's legions were systematically devastating the territory of tribes allied with Cassivelaunus. Farms were burned, cattle slaughtered, grain stores destroyed. The civilian population was bearing the cost of continued resistance, while the warriors remained relatively safe in their hill forts. Additionally, some British tribes had chosen to ally with Rome rather than resist. These tribes provided intelligence, supplies, and auxiliary forces to the Romans in exchange for favourable treatment. The political unity that had allowed Cassivelaunus to assemble a large British army was fracturing under the pressure of Roman economic warfare and diplomatic manipulation. Cassivelaunus negotiated terms that allowed him to retain power while acknowledging Roman supremacy. He would provide hostages, guarantee not to attack Roman allies, and pay annual tribute. From Caesar's perspective, this was sufficient. He had demonstrated that Rome could invade Britain at will, defeat British armies, and impose Roman terms. The specific details of provincial administration could wait until Rome was ready to commit the resources for permanent occupation. The 90 years between Caesar's expeditions and the Claudian invasion in 43 AD saw significant changes in British military systems. Some British leaders recognised that chariot warfare was obsolete against Roman tactics and began developing alternative approaches. Caratacus, who would lead resistance against the 43 AD invasion, emphasised infantry forces supported by light cavalry rather than chariots. His tactics relied on ambush, night attacks, and fighting in terrain where Roman advantages in discipline and formation fighting were minimised. But most British tribes clung to traditional methods. Chariot warfare was culturally important, tied to concepts of aristocratic honour and martial prowess. Abandoning chariots meant abandoning centuries of tradition and the social structures built around chariot-owning aristocracies. Conservative elements within British society resisted military innovation because it threatened their social position. This cultural conservatism would prove fatal when Rome returned in 43 AD with 4 legions and a clear intention to conquer and occupy rather than simply raid. The British forces that assembled to resist this invasion still relied heavily on chariot tactics that Roman soldiers now countered almost automatically. The tactical innovations that had required Caesar's genius to develop had become standard procedure taught to every Roman recruit. The Medway crossing that broke British resistance in 43 AD employed tactics that would have been revolutionary in Caesar's time but were now routine. Batavian auxiliaries swimming rivers in full equipment, auxiliary cavalry coordinating with legion infantry, artillery providing covering fire, systematic reconnaissance identifying crossing points. All of these were standard Roman military procedures by the mid-1st century. The British defenders fought with traditional courage. They assembled massive forces, their chariots charged repeatedly, individual warriors demonstrated remarkable bravery. But they were applying 40-year-old tactics against an enemy whose doctrine had evolved continuously. It was like fighting with weapons your grandfather had used against opponents using the latest technology. The 2-day battle at the Medway saw systematic destruction of British military power. Roman forces crossed at multiple points, established bridgeheads, linked up the bridgeheads into a continuous position, then advanced inland with disciplined cohesion that British forces couldn't match. Casualties were lopsided not because Romans were supermen, but because Roman tactical systems were simply more efficient at converting combat into enemy deaths while minimising friendly losses. Caratacus and Togodumnus, the British leaders, both survived the Medway initially, but Togodumnus was killed shortly after in circumstances the historical record doesn't clearly preserve. Caratacus retreated westward into Wales, where he would continue resistance for another 9 years using guerrilla tactics that were far more effective than the conventional warfare that had failed so catastrophically. The subsequent Roman advance through southern Britain met sporadic resistance, but nothing that could be called organised military opposition. British tribes that had remained neutral or supported resistance now scrambled to make peace with Rome. The speed of the collapse suggests that the Medway hadn't just defeated an army, but had shattered British confidence in their entire military system. Within 4 years, most of lowland Britain was under Roman control. Legionary fortresses were established at strategic points, road networks were constructed, administrative systems were imposed. The conquest wasn't complete. Wales and northern England would require decades of additional campaigning, but the decisive phase was finished remarkably quickly. The ease of this conquest reflects the fundamental asymmetry between Roman military systems and British tribal warfare. Rome had an institutional structure that learned from defeats, adapted continuously, and disseminated innovations efficiently. British tribes had warrior traditions that were individually impressive, but collectively inflexible. Roman soldiers were cogs, in a machine that functioned regardless of individual quality. British warriors were individuals whose effectiveness depended on personal skill and courage. When these systems collided, individual encounters might favour the Britons. A skilled chariot warrior in ideal terrain against isolated Roman soldiers could achieve impressive kills. But over hundreds of engagements, the systematic efficiency of Roman warfare ground down individual British advantages. The Romans didn't need to win every encounter, they just needed to win more than they lost, and their system guaranteed they would. The multi-generational perspective reveals the real story. The legionaries who waded through the surf in 55 BC were terrified of chariots and nearly broke. The legionaries who crossed the Medway in 43 AD barely considered chariots a significant threat. They were just another tactical problem with known solutions. That transformation happened because Rome had systems to capture lessons, refine tactics, and train new soldiers in improved methods. British warriors in 43 AD were using essentially the same tactics their grandfathers had used against Caesar. They were brave, they fought hard, they died well, but they died in massive numbers because their military culture couldn't adapt as quickly as Rome's institutional learning systems could evolve. The story of Rome versus the British chariots is often told as evidence of Roman military superiority. That's too simple. The Romans weren't inherently superior warriors. Many of them were conscripted farmers and urban poor with no particular martial heritage. What Rome had was a system that converted ordinary men into effective soldiers through training, organised those soldiers into formations that maximised their collective effectiveness, and continuously refined its methods based on battlefield experience. The Britons had genuinely skilled warriors, sophisticated weapons technology, and tactical systems that had proven effective for centuries. What they lacked was institutional flexibility. They couldn't learn as fast as Rome could teach. They couldn't adapt as quickly as Rome could evolve. They couldn't coordinate as effectively as Rome could organise. The refusal of those legionaries to break on the British beaches in 55 BC wasn't about personal courage. Courage is individual and inconsistent. It was about training that made formation integrity automatic, about social bonds that made abandoning comrades unthinkable, about military culture that valued disciplined execution over individual glory. These weren't natural human responses. They were carefully constructed psychological architecture built through systematic training. The British warriors who drove their chariots into the Roman formations were demonstrating natural human courage, the willingness to face danger for honour and glory. The Roman legionaries who stood their ground despite terror were demonstrating institutional conditioning that overrode natural human responses. Over the long term, conditioning beats courage because conditioning is consistent and courage is variable. This is the deeper lesson of the Roman conquest of Britain. Superior military systems beat superior individual warriors. Institutional learning beats traditional expertise. Systematic adaptation beats heroic resistance. The thunder of Celtic chariots that had dominated British battlefields for a millennium was silenced not by better weapons or braver soldiers, but by an enemy whose military culture was built around continuous improvement rather than traditional excellence. The legionaries who finally conquered Britain in 43 AD probably never thought about the terrified soldiers who had nearly broken on those same beaches 90 years earlier. They didn't need to. The lessons those earlier soldiers had learned through blood and terror had been captured, refined, and incorporated into standard training. Each generation of Roman soldiers inherited the accumulated wisdom of previous generations, without having to relearn those lessons personally. The British warriors had no such inheritance. Each generation learned from the previous through oral tradition and example, but there was no systematic capture of tactical lessons, no institutional refinement of methods, no standardized training that guaranteed each new warrior benefited from all previous experience. They were brave, they were skilled, they were fighting for their homeland and freedom. They still lost because bravery and skill without systematic organization lose to systematic organization even with mediocre bravery and skill. The Celtic chariots were magnificent machines crewed by magnificent warriors using magnificent tactics that were obsolete the moment they encountered an enemy capable of learning faster than tradition could adapt. The tragedy of the British resistance wasn't that their warriors weren't good enough. It was that being good enough individually couldn't compete with being systematically efficient collectively. Rome didn't beat Britain through superior soldiers. Rome beat Britain through superior systems. And systems, not heroes, win wars.